Good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is Sabir, pronouns he, him, and I direct events here at the Strand. Before we launch into a discussion of Brandon Taylor's Filthy Animals, I'd like to share a little bit of history about the Strand. The Strand was founded in 1927 by Benjamin Bass over on 4th Avenue's Book Row. Stretching from Union Square, Book Row stretching from Union Square to Astor Place, Book Row gradually dwindled from 48 bookstores until, after over 94 years, the Strand is a sole survivor, now run by third generation owner Nancy Bass Wyden. We want to thank all of you for your support. Without our loyal community of book lovers, the time and efforts of authors like Brandon and Omari, we wouldn't be here today, and we are so truly appreciative of it. Tonight, we are thrilled to have with us Brandon Taylor for the launch of his new story collection, Filthy Animals. Brandon is the author of the acclaimed novel Real Life, which has been shortlisted for the Booker Prize, longlisted for the Center for Fiction's First Novel Prize, and named a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice. He holds graduate degrees from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and the University of Iowa, where he was an Iowa Arts Fellow at the Iowa Writers Workshop in Fiction. Joining Brandon in conversation is Omari Weekes. Omari is an assistant professor of English and American Ethnic Studies at Willamette University. His writing has appeared in The Black Scholar, N+1, Book Forum, The Point, Jewish Currents, and other venues. Originally from Queens, New York, he currently lives in Portland, Oregon. And so, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Brandon and Omari to the stage.
Hi, Omari. So good
How
to
are
see
you?
you.
Yeah,
Hanging in. How are you?
yeah. Doing great. I read a lovely short story collection over the past few days that I'm really excited to talk about. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Well, let me know what it is and maybe I'll read it too.
Yeah, maybe. So in starting our conversation, I kind of wanted to just like start by talking about queerness, which I feel like is like a word we all kind of know, but like we often deploy in various different ways. So like as I was reading Filthy Animals, which again is a collection I really loved and couldn't put down, I brought it with me into the wilderness while I was camping in Yosemite for a few days. Um, as I was reading it, I was thinking about Eve Sedgwick, who's a queer theorist, kind of describes queerness as this: the open mesh of possibilities, gaps, overlaps, dissonances and resonances, lapses and excesses of meaning, when the constituent elements of anyone's gender, of anyone's sexuality aren't made or can't be made to signify monolithically. And I kept turning to that because I think queerness in this novel, in a lot of ways, really does exceed meaning. So I was wondering if like that kind of definition resonates with you in the way in which you were thinking about these stories. And if not, like what does queerness mean for you?
Yeah, I think that absolutely resonates with my own idea of queerness. I have this running joke with my good friend Garth Greenwell. The joke of something that I call like queer beatitudes. Like we'll be like moving through the world and like we'll like pass like a construction man like hammering something in downtown Iowa City, and I'll be like, that's a queer beatitude. Or like
Okay.
we'll like encounter like an old woman like holding up her very small dog as they cross the bridge, and I'll be like, that's a queer beatitude. This idea of queerness being something that is, I think, like multifarious and like multifaceted, and this sort of queerness being so context dependent. Even,
Mm,
it's the thing that queerness being, the work of a moment, this sort of unlikely joining of unlike forces in some sort of spontaneous happenstance. And so I think of queerness as not being a particular set of pre-existing constructs or configurations that we can point to, although that is increasingly what it is in our
yeah,
capitalist
yeah.
hellscape. Like that, like maybe that is also queerness, but to me, queerness lives in the moment and it lives in the context and it follows us moving through the world. So for me, it's always a moving target.
Yeah. And like one of the things I was thinking of too is in the kind of story that really goes through a lot of the different stories in the collection between Lionel, Charlie, and Sylvia is like about like how do we begin to think about this as queer, right? Because I feel like the kind of like natural way to think about this, especially with regards to Lionel, would be like about like bisexuality as a kind of like category to place on him. He has these kind of intimate relationships with Sylvia, and like he has this kind of moment in which like he really wants to like touch her, and it's like erotic but like not erotic. It's like a Lordian kind of erotic that's both about sex and not. So I wonder if you kind of like think about like how queerness, you know, even within the collection, even within these stories, right, eschew these kinds of like, I hate to say like eschew labels, right, because that feels like a kind of like that's what everybody's saying or whatever. But maybe I guess I'm asking about like how would you like label the queerness within that kind of triumvirate, the kind of like trifecta between those two characters.
Yeah. So I guess for a little bit of context for people who haven't yet read the book. So Filthy Animals is a collection that's made up of 11 stories, and about half of those stories follow one group of characters. I call them the Lionel, Charles, Sophie stories. And in the first story in the book called Potluck, Lionel, who's like a sort of depressive, like melancholic black homosexual, as is my tendency, he goes to a potluck, and after recently getting out of a hospital following a suicide attempt, and he meets these two dancers who are a couple, Charles and Sophie. And he, over the course of a few snowy days in Madison, Wisconsin, he sort of falls in with them, and he becomes a part of their relationship, and maybe a part of a game that Sophie is playing with everybody else. And I do think a lot about it. Felt very important to me that that Lionel had this charged relationship, not just with Charles, who he is sexually involved with, but also with Sophie. It felt very important not to sort of be like, well, of course he's going to go to the potluck and sleep with the dude, but like the woman is just there as like an addendum, you know, like she's just the woman who gets cheated on by her boyfriend when he goes home with a depressed math geek. And I, you know, when I first started writing those stories, like that was the story I thought I was telling. Like I thought I was telling the story of the shady down low ballet dancer who sleeps with the dude. And so I wrote the first story, and then I was writing the second story in that cycle, Meet, where Charles has to tell Sophie what he did. And I was really struggling with that story because like that conversation where he's got to disclose what he did the night before, I was just like, wow, this is really boring. This is so boring. Like I've seen this before. Like I have been the Lionel in that situation many a time. And I thought, what would happen if I put that in Sophie's mouth? Like, what if I let her say, oh, this is so boring. Like, you know that I'm not here to lay a claim on you. Like, that's not what this is about. We're in a relationship. I care about you as a person. Did you have a great time? And I thought, what if I sort of take monogamy off the table in its sort of pre-existing ordering constructs, and I really just get into the meat of these characters and their relationship among the three of them. Then like when you take monogamy out of the picture, then you have, as a writer, you don't have this pre-made map anymore. You've just got to like figure out who these characters are and how they fit together and how they move and stuff. And so that to me was really important, both to the plot of that story arc, but also like the idea of queerness in there, because you know, Lionel considers himself like a gay man, but he has this intense connection with Sophie because they share this sort of existential mordancy that Charles is excluded from. And so I thought, if I take monogamy out, if I take heterosexuality out, and if I take the idea that like a gay man and a woman can't be sort of sexually or like compatible in a sort of animalistic, deep human way, if I take all that out and I just am confronted with people and figuring out how people fit together, then like that to me is so much more interesting than to have Charles tell his girlfriend, yeah, I slept with a dude. Like that's just, I'm like, that's boring. What's interesting is people confronted with people.
Yeah, that's so great. Because I think one of the things that I'm also thinking about in relationship to what you just said is like, you know, I ask this question a lot. I think I asked this maybe in like a recent a thing for book forum that was like, what is intimacy? Like, it's a question I was asked at like a job talk that like I didn't get the job because I was just like, I talk about intimacy a lot, but like for me, it's just like
What
something
a,
that we feel as opposed to something we like describe.
what a
Um,
dangerous question.
so, well, it's a question I'm about to pose to you.
Oh no.
Well, because part of it is like I think in the text, it's something that I was thinking about a lot. But like, there's often like something like a fear or threat that undergirds intimacy in the text that I always like I find like quite interesting, right? Like here you were just talking about part of what kind of connects Sophie and Lionel is like a relationship to death, right? Both the death of others and then like the death of the self, right? The idea of the death of the self. So I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about how you see like fear or threat undergirding the kinds of intimacies you create in this collection. I'm going to ask a follow-up question later about like how this kind of works in the dialogue you create, but I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, like the relationship perhaps between fear and threat and intimacy.
Yeah, I mean, I think intimacy is I think that intimacy is very poorly understood. I think it's one of those things that we because it to me it's so fraught and so complicated. And I feel like in our culture and in language, those things which are so terrifying, we will sort of like shroud them in cliche to control them and to sort
Yeah.
of keep them from being too terrifying. And I feel like intimacy is very much one of those things where we have all this received knowledge about intimacy. Like intimacy is good,
Yeah.
emotional availability is good. You
Yeah.
should be intimate with people. Like we have all these ideas about like the ways that intimacy should work in a society and in a culture. And the way that I've always experienced it in a very sort of Carrie Bradshaw way. Like
Okay.
I think with intimacy, the thing that's most dangerous about it is that you've just got to like show the other person in an exchange. You've got to show them your belly. You have to show them
Yeah.
the place where you are most vulnerable and most exposed. And I remember asking a friend once, like, how do you how do you know when you're in love with someone and you tell them you love them? How do you know that they aren't gonna like be awful to you? And my friend is like, well, you don't. Like that's why that's how intimacy works. And I was like, that sounds like a scam.
Okay.
That sounds like a setup. And so for me, intimacy is always charged with the capacity for violence. Like to me, intimacy, the reason that intimacy has so many rewards is because you're entering into an exchange wherein you are letting someone, you're granting them such power and control over your self-worth and self-value and self-identification. You're giving them the keys and you're being like, don't hurt me. And you just gotta like hope they won't. But
Yeah.
because they're human, they probably will. So I mean, it's just intimacy to me is always a very charged space. And when I sit down to write, I'm always trying to capture all of the sort of complications of intimacy, all the ways that through knowing you, another person becomes this like perfect weapon to destroy you. And when you tell someone all about yourself, that means that they now have all the tools they need to eradicate you and to get
Mhm.
you where you are most exposed and vulnerable. And I think that people don't want to think about that. Like I think
Yeah.
they're like, "Oh, I love you. We're so intimate." And they don't want to think about the fact that that person literally has a sword and it is hanging over your neck for the rest of your life. And you know, maybe that's just because I'm a suspicious person. Maybe that's just because I have intimacy issues. But I like my characters to feel, I don't know, I like to attend to all of the potential threats of intimacy and not to just sort of present some sanitized like lifetime movie idea, although those movies are very violent, like a very sort of
Hmm.
silly idea of intimacy, because I don't want to turn it into a cartoon, because the fact of the matter is human relationships are full of danger. Like, it's just it's harrowing to be known, I think.
Yeah. I think part of it too is like, and this is something I talk to my students about a lot, especially with like older novels, where they're like, I feel like when characters talk to one another, they just like don't talk to each other like real people. Like I would never talk in these like complete sentences with like great grammar, and like everybody like totally understands exactly what I'm trying to say. or if they like misunderstand what I'm trying to say, that becomes like an extremely important plot point. In a way that like in a lot of your stories, I feel like part of what the threat and the violence of intimacy is almost kind of about like the ordinariness of just like being misunderstood. That language, as much as we think about it as being totally and completely precise in a lot of ways, right, can often be misunderstood because of the ways in which it is actually quite imprecise. So I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about like how like dialogue helps us to kind of think about these threats as well. I think when in a lot of the stories, what ends up happening is like somebody will say something and somebody will just like come out and say like, I don't understand what you mean, right? I really just like, I'm not understanding, right? And that allows for either a better kind of intimacy between those two characters, or it's actually something that's dropped because there's a lot of things that we just like can't describe, right? So I was just like wondering if you could talk a little bit about like, yeah, how you craft dialogue in some of these moments.
Yeah, well, that's really kind of you. It makes me feel good because for the longest time, people in my writing workshop said that my dialogue was bad. And I was like, is it though? Like, I feel like it's not. So for me, dialogue, which used to be a thing that I ran away from as a writer, I was like, I'm just here to describe stuff, like that dialogue stuff for the birds. And then I realized that like the gulf between characters is never more apparent than in dialogue. Like dialogue is like the most, it's really the only direct means of collision you can achieve in like prose narrative. Like, yeah, I can describe characters grappling with each other and I can describe characters getting into a fist fight, but that to me feels so secondary to the violence that you can wreak by letting a character peel back all of that and literally just beam their impressions of the other person at them. Like when you really think about it, like there's hostility in punching someone, and there's also hostility in telling someone exactly what you think of them. And to me, like trying to describe like a physical encounter, like it's possible to do that with the same immediacy and urgency that gets close to a mimesis of what we do in real sort of actual physical space. But to me, dialogue is the thing that has a almost one-to-one sort of relation to what we do in actual meat space. So like you and I talking verbally now, like it's really easy to get very close to replicating that on the page. And so dialogue is this incredible tool to like literally have characters interact with each other's thoughts and feelings and emotions. And I feel like there is something that is like incredibly painful when you think that you are vibing with someone and then they'll say something and you're like, oh, like we are not on the same page. And there's just something about the power of a single word or a single sentence to erase whatever affinity, you know, a person was feeling for another person. Like we've all had that thing where we like meet someone at a party and it's going great, and then they accidentally reveal that they are a Republican, or like accidentally reveal that they you know have politics that don't align with ours. And those moments are so deeply interesting to me. And like I feel like you can't get those moments if you're so consumed with trying to write like a punchy plot, or trying to write like a very punchy sort of physically blocked scene. I think dialogue is where, for me, the story really comes to life and where it really takes off. And I think that part of writing good dialogue is finding a way to replicate the turbulence that is a misunderstanding within any exchange, and not to run from it as a writer. I think that sometimes the reason that characters sort of talk in these complete sentences is because writers are afraid of that turbulence. They're afraid of, because if you write a character being awkward, then suddenly the characters in the story have to contend with that awkwardness. They have to contend with the character's inability to be articulate about their emotions. And then suddenly you have created a problem that you have to solve as a writer narratively. But it is a narrative problem that again closely mimics a problem in a real meat space social situation, which is that we as people have a difficult time with awkwardness. And so then we're like people who don't know how to deal with awkwardness trying to write people who have to deal with awkwardness for the story to go on. And so I think a lot of writers slip into letting their characters be hyper eloquent and being hyper fluent instead of leaning into the turbulence, instead of being like, okay, I have to throw out my plan and I just have to follow these characters into these sites of discomfort and social collision. And I feel like that's kind of where I live as a writer. Like that's the place where I feel like as a writer and as an artist, I've kind of made my home is in these places that I think a lot of writers are afraid to go because they're like, I don't know how to write that. And I'm like, well, I don't either until I do it. Like you've just got to like follow the characters. And I think in so much as intimacy, it's incredibly important because if characters can't talk to each other in a story, there is no relationship. And if there is no relationship, there is no narrative, there's no story there.
Yeah. So, I mean, I was going to ask this question before, like, what do you miss the most about dinner parties and why is it awkwardness? Was like how, like something I was going to ask. That was like, because I think about this a lot too. I don't know if you've been to dinner parties. Again, I don't know if you're going back into that life. I understand people who just like aren't. But one of the things that I've been thinking about, especially as somebody who like lives in, I'm in LA right now, but I live in Portland, is just like being that like Black person in these kinds of social spaces that then becomes like the representation of Blackness, right? And that's always quite awkward.
Yeah.
So what do you miss most about dinner parties?
Hmm.
Or what have you, if you've been back to dinner parties, like what are you reveling in the most, I guess?
Hmm. I haven't been back to like a dinner party, although I did go to a barbecue recently, a going away barbecue for a friend. And that was really nice. I really sort of, I realized like, oh, people, like, oh, humans. And I mean, I sort of miss the same things that I miss about dinner parties are the things that I missed most about not being about going into cafes, which is just like seeing other people and
Yeah.
like I realized that I had sort of stopped imagining the inner lives of other humans and like other people because I had, I just wasn't encountering people I had to like interact with. And so like there wasn't that practice of that sort of dreamily imagining like what another person is thinking and what they're doing and that sort of thing. And it's really hard to write fiction if that muscle atrophies. Like
Yeah, I'm sure.
it's
I'm
really
sure,
hard
yeah.
to write fiction because then you're just like, well, I'm me, but like other people, what are they like? I don't know.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I feel like in the same way that like the great painters used to go and like look at Lascaux, or they would go to they would just like travel the world to find shapes and just things to experience to render into painting or figurative work. I feel like as a fiction writer, I I need to be able to move through the world and see people and see them interact and see them do stuff, and not even in a sort of like creepy auto fictiony way, but like just the what are people like what are they like what are the social shapes that are happening. And I kind of miss that about dinner parties. Like I miss just the seeing of people. I'm sort of hungry for the social shapes to come back and to see people doing stuff, even weird stuff. I kind of miss weird stuff.
Yeah.
I do not miss the awkward moment at every white person dinner party where they kind of like look at you like, so what do you make of all this? And just like
Hmm.
gesturing to the house, the party, the world,
Hmm.
and then giving you no inclination like how you're supposed to answer their question. I don't miss that. I do not miss that, but I do miss the shapes of it all, the just the figuration of being in a a human world.
Well, the right answer was raisins and potato salad, so that's like totally okay. But
Damn.
I'm
Oh.
so sorry. I'm so sorry. And I also just wanted to. I'm gonna switch gears a little bit, but I also wanted to invite people to ask questions. There'll be time for Q&A, so be sure to get those questions in. So I kind of wanted to talk about like the Midwest. Um,
Please.
so it feels often in some of the stories like the Midwest itself is like a character. And as a self-professed coastal elite, um, part of what I'm interested in is the way in which the Midwest becomes like both queerer and blacker than the way in which we often kind of think about it in terms of its stereotypes. The Midwest is often configured as white, heterosexual, if not rural, suburban, which is weird because in order for there to be a suburban, you need an urban, and everybody thinks that Chicago is like the only like urban space in the Midwest, for those of us who have never been to the Midwest. So I was wondering if you could think about or talk a little bit about, do you see the Midwest itself as a character, either in your first novel or in some of the stories in Filthy Animals? And if so, like, how do you, or what kind of face for the Midwest as a character do you want to, or did you want to show us?
Mm. Yeah, I mean that's a fantastic question. I think it's I was recently asked about this somewhere else, and they were like, "So, what is your relationship to the Midwest?" And I was just like, "Well, the relationship to my writing about the Midwest is that in my first book, I didn't feel confident enough to like name anything, so I didn't. And in my second book, I felt more confident, and so I named stuff. And then my third book, my sort of next two books, I am just like fully in there. Things get named, people get named.
No chill anymore.
I felt so confident that in my fourth book, which is a museum novel, I like literally just made up a museum and put it in Madison, Wisconsin. And so like my sort of increasing comfort, I think much to the terror of unsuspecting Midwesterners, has like caused me to like really lean in hard. I mean, I think that the Midwest is incredibly interesting. Like, and I will say that like my experience of the Midwest is like mostly constrained to like Big Ten college towns.
Mm-hmm.
So like that's a very particular slice of the Midwest. I think, I mean, the thing that sort of like blew my mind is that some of the some of the kids some of the kids here in Iowa City would say to me, they'd be like, "Yeah, my dad told me like don't forget who I am when I go to the big city," like meaning Iowa City. And I was like, there isn't even like a Costco here. Like, what are we, like, what's going on? So I think the Midwest is a really interesting place. It's a really interesting confluence of like ideas. Like a lot of people have ideas about the Midwest and they think that the Midwest is one thing. I always feel like when people think about the Midwest, they're thinking like something like some unholy union between like Illinois and Ohio, but like the
Yeah.
Midwestern part of Ohio, like not the part of Ohio that is basically the South.
Yeah.
And I think that, the Midwest is such a fascinating place because it is relatively agrarian. I mean, it's not as agrarian as the South still is, but it's kind of agrarian. Like the big economic drivers of the region are, the farms and although that's becoming increasingly corporate. So when I'm writing about the Midwest, I think what I'm trying to do, I'm always careful to pick characters who are either transplants to the Midwest or people who feel kind of out of place in it. Because I feel like I don't yet feel comfortable enough writing about the Midwest in a very Willa Cather way. Like, so like I'm not going to be writing any sort of like white Midwestern farm men, for example. Like that's not really a thing that I feel capable of doing. But I do feel comfortable writing about students and writing about
Mm.
academia and people who sort of orbit college towns because that is an experience I know very deeply. But it did feel important to me. I remember telling my agent early on, I was like, I plan to write characters in the Midwest who have always existed in the Midwest, but who, because of certain ideas about the region, have been excluded from that space. And that does include like queer characters, and that does include Black characters, because the Midwest is very Black. There are a lot of Black people
Yeah.
in them. There are so many
Totally.
Black people in the Midwest. Like all those Black people who left the South had to go somewhere, and they didn't all go to New York. Like the
New York's very
Midwest.
small.
I mean, there are and not just in Chicago, of course. Like there are like the reason I could talk for days about this, but like there are so many Black people in the Midwest, and there's so many queer people in the Midwest. And I'm not trying to render I'm not trying to sort of render a sort of at large and general proclamation about the queer Black Midwest. But it did feel important to me to say, like, I'm setting it in the Midwest because that's what I know. That's where I was a mature observational intelligence in the world. And I'm not going to cater to you liberal elites. Nobody's going to tell me what to do.
I mean, it's funny because I mean the other person I was thinking about like while I was reading Filthy Animals was Randall Keenan, who I feel like does a quite similar thing with the South, right? That like as much as we think about the South as often like a quite Black space, right? queerness often gets excised from like what the South is, right? At best, it's just like something that is totally abject, right? Like that's its relationship to the South
Mm-hmm.
in a way that Keenan makes. For those of you who don't know Randall Keenan, he's a North Carolinian writer who just passed away, whose short story collection "Let the Dead Bury Their Dead" was published in 1992. There's like a number of magical realists, just like queer short stories there, that really resonate with the way in which you were thinking about like how we can think about queerness as being central to the Midwest, how Blackness can be central to the Midwest, and those two things together, right, are so constitutive of what the Midwest can be. And in that way, you know, the one thing I was also thinking about too for Filthy Animals is religion and the way in which, you know, no, should I?
No. I was like, oh yeah, it's in there. It's all over that. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, I have a like a fetish for epigraphs. And so yours, which comes from John 15:19, if you of the world would love you as its own, right? Like that verse goes on to also talk about basically like it's about how being Christian is like going to be something that will get you a lot of hatred in a way in which like obviously I think the collection is really talking about how queerness kind of does that too, right? So that like a lot of people will hate you for being queer, but also you have a kind of placedness, even in this place that is often seen as being again like quite straight, quite white, and all that kind of stuff. So one of the things I wanted to ask you is like, and this comes up in a number of the stories as well, right? I'm thinking of the title story, Filthy Animals, in which a queer or just a black youth who has dalliances, is being sent to Idaho. And one of the things he thinks about is like, okay, why am I being sent to Idaho? Is it that I don't pray well enough, right? Is it that I'm not going to church well enough? And Christianity kind of like fits into a number of the other stories as well. So I was wondering if you could just like talk a little bit about how you see maybe not even just like the relationship between religion and Blackness being something that interests you, but also religion and queerness, right? Because we think about those two things as being like totally separate in a way that like I think this short story collection allows us to kind of imagine otherwise possibilities for what is a relationship between all three of these categories.
Yeah, that's a really fantastic question. I mean, I think maybe this is just because I'm Southern, but like I feel somehow that like nobody loves God more than like Southern Black gays. Like there's just something about like there's something about like Black gays and like the Black Southern church in particular. Like they are in church, honey. Like they
Uh-huh.
go to church and they love Jesus. And and so like I often think about that when the sort of white gays are on Twitter talking about how we're all just like godless heathens who want to be used and abused and destroyed. I'm just like, okay, but like the Black Baptists are not like that though. Like they really love Jesus also.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I grew up in a very strict Baptist household on a farm in rural Alabama, and so I really had no choice in my sort of religious upbringing. Like I was very Baptist until I wasn't because we kept being told that we were going to hell a lot. Like I had a rural preacher, so like the rural preachers are always very Old Testament-y. Like they
Mm-hmm.
love that part of the Old Testament where like God destroys the earth. Like they love all of that. Anything with God threatening to destroy the earth, destroying the earth, punishing a person, burning things down. They love Job. Um, so that was very much my concept of religion and my early religious life. And then I sort of moved I mean every Southern gay also does that thing where they like briefly become Catholic and then then they sort of scoot on to atheism.
Mm-hmm.
And that's sort of where I've landed for my own faith. But it would have felt disingenuous to write, you know, the title story, Filthy Animals, or that story, What Made You Made Them, without weaving in what is so in the air in those spaces, which is God and religious families. Sometimes when I read fiction, I'm always like, okay, but you're writing this story as though this person's parents didn't grow up going to church, which like they absolutely did. Because if you look at America in like the 80s, people were going to church. And so it always feels very important to me to sort of let the characters who would realistically have sort of these faith-based systems of meaning, like let that influence the story and the language and stuff like that. And it feels particularly important when writing about like Black queer characters, especially. And many of my characters in this book, but also in all my stories, they tend to be Black queer characters who are displaced from the South into the Midwest or into various weird spaces, and those characters often carry with them the sort of long trailing edge of a religious background, like a religious childhood. And I'm always interested in the ways that that informs who they are and how they make meaning and the language with which they make meaning. And so that's in some sense like the reason that it so permeates the stories, because I'm trying to do my due diligence there, but also because I am a Black homosexual from the South who had a religious upbringing, and so like my own systems of making meaning, even though I've left them behind, there's still the Bible. Like whenever I go for a lyric epiphany, my language gets very King Jamesy. Like if you look at James Baldwin, same thing. You know, it's like that is we have the same registers because we grew up listening to the same preachers, you know. But I think that sometimes, at least in discourses in American literature, I feel in some ways that, I don't know, like when critics talk about Black people's work, they're very careful to sort of skim around the God parts. But if like Ben Lerner mentions like an epistle, then suddenly it's like, ooh, this rich treatise on faith and religiosity, you know. And so I think that it has long been a neglected part of the critical tradition, at least sort of coming from the overculture toward Black art, to sort of leave religion aside or to presume a hostility between like Blackness and the church, or like Blackness and queerness, or queerness and the church. And to me, like those things, there is tension there, of course, but to me, they've always been, that tension exists, but it also, there are ways in which like Black people, like Black gays especially, really love God. And I feel like I want to create work that can accommodate that seeming paradox and to recognize it as a kind of false paradox, even in some ways. So it's important to me to write into interesting sites of tension and discomfort, and one of those being, you know, that curious triangle of the the Black homosexual who loves God so much. And Randall Keenan, I mean, the way that he, I mean, it's incredible. And like to read his work, to read those stories, you are deeply aware of somebody who is rendering the full complex tapestry, like of a sort of very particular Southern Black vision and framework. And yeah, and I mean, there are nothing but contradictions in Randall Keenan's work, and that means that there is no sort of seemingly easy paradox to point to there.
Yeah, and also it's like, in a lot of ways, it often feels like even just like working out those paradoxes are like totally beside the point, right?
You know, like it's not interesting.
You know.
There are other things to do because he assumes that you get it. You're like, well, you know that one choir director. I don't have to explain how this is not a paradox to you.
Very
yeah,
sweet
totally.
at a choir director, you know.
Not sweet. Oh my God, I'm traumatized again. Wow, the number of times I was called sweetness by angry boy cousins. Oof.
I'm so sorry. I don't mean to. I don't mean to do that to you. And in public too.
Oh, what a violence.
I'm so sorry. I kind of wanted to ask like another question that's about like, who do you got for Wimbledon?
Who do I have for Wimbledon? Wow.
It's coming. I wanted you to be open to talking more about tennis in public spaces. For those of you who don't follow Brandon on Twitter, this was a thing for a hot second during the French.
Yeah, so like Naomi Osaka pulled out of the French after some tomfoolery from the tournament directors, and I tweeted about it, and somebody's like, "You don't even follow tennis," and I was like, "Excuse me, I have time today," so I pulled all the receipts of all the times I've talked about or written about tennis. But as for Wimbledon, I think that it's going to be giving like real 2012, 2013 weird Wimbledon energy. Like there's no way it's going to be a normal Wimbledon. I mean, I would love Roger Federer, although I think he's going to go out in like the third round probably.
I think so too.
It's devastating. I think probably Djokovic, and if not Djokovic, then maybe Zverev, maybe, although he's such a head case. Yes, Sparrow is such a head case. And on the women's side, I mean, who was even playing on the women's side? Maybe Serena. Always going to root for Venus and Serena at Wimbledon. Yeah, why not?
Yeah,
Chaos.
good,
I mean,
good.
the WTA has been bringing it with the chaos, the twists, the turns. I love
I
the
know.
WTA is really where it's at, honestly.
It truly is. And like I never get like, oh, three people have been doing or have taken all of the Grand Slams for like well over a decade and like that's way better. And it's like, I don't know. I just like love watching like random 18-year-olds win their first US Open, you
The
know?
depth on that on the WTA side, unparalleled.
I
The men
know.
are no who's doing it like the WTA. Nobody. Not the ATP, that's for sure. I guess we should answer all your
Yeah.
questions, and we could talk about Wimbledon all day.
Amen. Okay. So here's I'll read the first question. Could Brandon talk about the influence of Patricia Highsmith and Carol on his writing, and if it had any influence on this collection?
Yeah. So, yeah, always and forever. I love that novel. I love that movie, but I love the novel especially. And there are yeah, there are things that definitely found their way into this book, like the fact that everyone's always drinking coffee at like 8 p.m. I definitely stole that from Patricia Highsmith, but also the way
Oh,
that
really?
the way that she writes about snow, and the way that she writes about just like nature and characters moving through space was really influential. And like that novel, there's always like this weird twilight dusk
Hmm.
cast all over that book that I really was really into. Like it's such a melancholic and beautiful book. And so yeah, that book's attitudes and tonalities definitely found their way to the book. And the way that she writes relationships and
Hmm.
triangles and characters realizing things about themselves. Like she makes a person realizing something about themselves like dramatically interesting, you know? And that's like really powerful. So all that stuff found its way in. And then in a sort of really cheesy way, I would say that there's a line in real life that I basically stole from Patricia Highsmith and put into that book. But I won't tell you what it is. But if you message
Mm.
me on Twitter and make a guess, I will tell you if you are right or not. But yeah, there's like a line almost taken verbatim as a little sort of homage to that book. I love it so much. It teaches me so much about writing.
I was gonna say like I hope she's not like haunting you, but then it was like maybe actually he really loved if Patricia Highsmith was
We
haunting him.
listen. She is the type who would haunt. She is the
Yeah,
type
she
who would.
would. She
She
absolutely would.
mm-mm,
Absolutely would.
she Patricia Highsmith would haunt you absolutely, no doubt.
Okay. Next question. I was wondering what Brandon thinks makes a great short story, or if he could describe his own approach to the form.
Mm, yeah. So I think that for one thing, there are as many different kinds of stories that as there are people who want to write short stories, and so I think that the short story is an incredibly flexible, capacious form, and every short story kind of has its own agenda. You know, like there are the sort of pyrotechnic, high concept stories that are like lists and weird things. Um, there's that story, is it Bartholomew, like concerning the
Mm,
bodyguard?
hmm.
Like these sort of like high concept pomo short stories, those are really interesting. Voice driven stories are really interesting. More plot driven stories are very interesting. Character, it's very interesting. I think at heart, what all those stories have in common is intentionality on the part of the author. Like everything feels put into place by the author. It feels intentional. And it feels like this is not a writer who's sort of casting around looking for the change in their pockets. Like everything feels really settled into place and really intentional. Um, so that's one thing. That's one thing, intentionality. Another thing is that, and this may seem like a paradox, but I promise it's not, is like I love a short story that seems like it's sort of listing to one side, like it's kind of like you seem like you're sort of going out of the way, and then it loops around and it's like, oh, this is what the story is really about. And
Mm,
so I think that a great short story isn't just about the one thing, it's about the thing you don't see coming because you think that it's about something else. So a sense of purposeful misdirection that pays off I think that's one thing that can make a really great short story. And another thing is that I think that, there's this idea that the short story is a thing that you read once because our attentions are so short and then you move on. But I think when you write a story like that, that is not a short story. Like, that's just a gimmick. I think the way that I think about a great short story is that same way that I think about the difference between a joke and humor. Like, humor is a system of intelligence with which we understand the world, and a joke is like a one-time thing that makes you laugh once. And so a great short story is like humor. It is a system of intelligence that sort of sifts over some ideas and takes you to an unexpected revelatory place. And so that, to me, at least in my own work, is the aim and intention of the story. And so I don't want to write a story that a person reads once and like that's it. Like, when I was in my writing program, people would say to me, they'd be like, "Oh, but like I had to read this, like I read this story once and then I had to like read it over again." And I was like, "Yeah, that is literature." like that is the point. And so I think a great short story, not only does a great short story stand up under rereading, but a great short story demands rereading. And so that's another thing that makes a great story, is all these different layers and subtleties and tonalities and tensions. And so even more than a point of craft, I just think those, if you hold those standards in your mind when you're writing a story or when you're engaging a story, that will tell you if that story is great or not. It's really about, a story demands a rereading and it demands close attention.
Yeah, I love that answer. It's so much about like, a short story is almost like the perfect balance between like poetry and novels, right?
Honestly, yeah.
Yeah, it gives you the economy of like, I can totally reread this again, and also like you think about it in its deliberateness. Like, I always think about like Toni Morrison's only short story Recitative, right? That's like kind of like felt like what you were just describing, is like how short stories are supposed to work.
Yeah.
Okay, but I will ask another question. Are there story collections that influenced or you feel are in conversation with Filthy Animals?
Oh, I mean, yeah. So Mavis Gallant has this short story collection called Varieties of Exile. It was one of the like New York Review of Books classics reissues of her stories. And I didn't realize before I read that book that you could have stories with characters who recurred. I didn't know that was a thing. Didn't know about it because I was a chemist, and so I didn't read a lot of books. But that book has her collected stories, has her linked stories in it. So it has the Lynette Mura stories, it has her Corrette sister stories, which I think are some of her masterpieces, especially the story Florida is just really incredible. And The Chosen Husband's really good. And then it has, I think, the Henri Griep stories are in that book as well, I think. Was Lauren Groff's book of stories, Florida, was really important for this book. I mean, Danielle Evans's first collection, Before You Suffocate Your Own Fool Self, and bits from her second collection, Department of Historical Corrections, that she was publishing as I was learning how to write stories. Those were also really, really, really important to this book. So those are just like some of the books. Also, Nicole Krauss has the story Seeing Her Shoddy that's in her new collection, How to Be a Man. That's like, I think about that story all the time. I read that story like 3 times a month. Like, I love that story so deeply, and I still don't know how she gets away with not writing any scenes. Like, how does she do it? I have no idea. She's a magician. So those are some collections that really that are kind of the bedrock of this book.
Great. So next question. I love asking writers what their favorite word is. So I'm wondering if you, Brandon, and oh no, not me, who is my advisor for a brief second at Willamette, have a favorite word. Brandon, what's your favorite word?
Ooh,
that's a tough question.
My favorite word? We used to get asked this question all the time in French class. Teacher would be like, "What's your favorite word?" And I'd always be like, "Boire." So maybe boire, to drink.
Yeah, that's so good. I don't have one. I would say like superfluous.
Oh, that's a great word though. Or svelte. I love svelte.
Oh,
that's a
great
good word.
That's good.
Maybe boire or svelte would be my two.
Here's the next one. Can you talk about how you approach writing about mental illness?
Yeah, so the way that I approach it is, and this will sound like a really flippant answer, but I promise it's not. Um, when I was writing when I was writing the stories in this book, I hadn't yet started to write nonfiction about mental illness or mental health. I didn't had never written an essay before I started writing this book, and my goal in writing about it in this book was just to write about it as though to write about it in a way that wouldn't bore me or make me irritated or annoyed, because so much of the writing about mental health or mental illness is so riddled with cliche, and it
Mm,
has this like, you can do it, come on,
yeah.
up and atom attitude, and it's so not accommodating of like those moments when you are so despairing that like you just literally can't even get out of bed. Like the language of mental illness and sort of the literature that I was reading at the time is so rooted in like this like, we're going to medicate you and make you better, and like thinking
Mm,
about wanting to kill yourself is a no-no. Like it was so forbidding, and I felt so lonely and isolated by it. And so my goal in writing about it was just to write about it in a way that wouldn't feel so restrictive and wouldn't feel so bad. And I was so determined not to punish my character for you know a, trying to kill himself, or and I wouldn't punish him for having struggles. Like I wouldn't punish him for that, and I wouldn't write as though his experience were an aberration. I wasn't trying to like, what I hope isn't true in the book is the thing that I was trying not to do is to write about his status and his situation and his context in a way that like wasn't punitive.
mm,
Like he feels that the world sees him as aberrant, but I was determined not to write him as aberrant. And so he feels as though the world thinks that he's wrong for feeling the way that he does, and for he thinks that the world sees him as sick. But I wanted to write the book in such a way that the book doesn't think that he is sick. He merely thinks that the world perceives him as sick. And that felt really important to me, defining the center from Lionel and not from the outside. Like I didn't want to write a book that was me spectating on this character,
yeah.
quote unquote, falling apart. I wanted to write a character who was going through something really difficult. And part of the difficulty is that he doesn't know how to talk about it to people, because people shut him down when he tries to talk about it. So part of that just comes from trying to erase some of my own loneliness, like when going through it, and to feel like I had someone to talk to about it. I felt like as long as I was writing Lionel, I had someone who I could get really dark with. I don't know, like he was sort of my companion through like a very difficult period in my life. But my approach is always to center the individual subjectivity, and to not write them as though they are aberrant or sick or broken, but to write them as they are, and to let the world to sort of be truthful in my portrayal of their reaction to the world's perception of them. So it's really just about trying not to bore myself and trying not to write something that I would feel as a person with similar struggles, that I would feel like, oh, that's not how it is. Like, why is it
Yeah.
always like this? Why is it always like white lady under a blanket at night, like depression commercial? Like, it's not like that. Like, I mean, it is sometimes, but it's not all like that. So.
It's not always like the woman in the window. Did you see that movie?
Oh my god. I mean, though sometimes it is, and that movie was a vibe. I
Yes,
relate
yes.
so heavily.
Um, I think we have time for another question. So, congrats on the adaptation of real life. Yes, congrats. Going into the process, curious what's important to you in order to maintain the novel's authenticity.
I mean, I mean, novels authenticity. Like when I was like 12 or maybe 14, I saw the Aragon movie after reading the books. It's about this boy who finds a dragon egg, and then he raises the dragon, and then he like fights the forces of evil, which are like some nebulous stand-in for like immigration or something. But like
Oh, girl.
I mean, it's like if you kick the tires on that book, it's kind of
Yeah.
problematic. But anyway, and I felt really enraged because they had like not included everything. I mean, I think that for me, as long as as long as the vibe of the book is maintained, I am happy.
Yeah.
I mean, I just think that film and fiction, narrative, sort of prose fiction, are just like such different media that it would be naive to think that one could preserve everything. And so I'm trying not even to sort of frame my thinking as like authentic to the novel. The thing that I hope is preserved is just the feeling of the book, that kind of like dreamy weekend gone
Mm,
horribly wrong energy of it all. The sort of, and so I just hope the emotional rigor and the tone of the book are the things that I hope are preserved. And I think that those are the things that are easiest, I think, to translate from novel to film, which baffles, which is why I'm always baffled when books and movies have such different vibes. I'm like, the vibe is like the one
yeah.
thing you can translate. Like that's the part that's just like music cues. Like that's so easy to keep the vibe. But those are the things that I hope translate.
I'm gonna say that dinner party scene is gonna have to be clutch. You know, it's
I think,
gonna.
but I feel like that's the part of the book that is most cinematic. Like people are like, this novel's not very cinematic. I'm like, please, have you seen movies? Like movies love a dinner party. Movies, I think movies do dinner parties and social collision better than almost any other medium.
It's gonna be so spectacularly like everything that goes wrong at a dinner party is just like in that scene, right?
I mean, and I feel like part of why that part is so cinematic is because like when I was writing that, well, when I was revising that, I was watching so many movies that had dinner parties in them. Like
Hmm.
Russell Harbaugh's movie Love After Love is just, it opens with this incredible scene of people getting together after a long, sort of with horrible, I mean, like someone's gonna die soon, but like it's a really beautiful movie and like it has a great dinner party at the beginning of it. And I was like, that's what I want to do. Like that's the stuff that I want to capture. And so much of watching movies went into making the novel that I think they got it. I mean, it's it's gonna be fine. It's gonna be
I'm
so
so
fine.
excited. I'm so excited, Sophia. Hey.
Hey, thank you both so much. That was such a delightful hour.
Oh, no, I was gonna say it was great. I had a great time. I had a
Yeah, me
wonderful.
too. Thank you, Brandon. It was so fun.
Yeah, and thank you to our audience for spending your evening with us. If you haven't purchased Filthy Animals, there's a green button center of your screen. You can get a signed copy. I have stolen this one for myself. I will pay for it if anyone's watching. But yeah, on that note, thank you everyone and have a fantastic evening.
Thanks everybody. Thanks so
Thank you,
much.
everybody.